Guys, Unehiya is building the argument as we speak. We call it a list of acknowledgments, but it's what we're gonna present to Congress to prove who we are. The first clapback is gonna be the obvious one. Our opponents are gonna say, if you guys are Indians, why have you been identifying as African Americans all this time? That's what this compilation is designed to answer. It's a summary of my personal contributions to the list of acknowledgments regarding how our identity switched from Indian to African. I'm showing you excerpts taken from 4 videos and piecing them together like a puzzle to demonstrate how the argument fits together so far. A lot of you have insights to add to this, so join Unehiya using the link in the description and add whatever we've left out so far. Be reminded that the Harlem Renaissance wasn't originally called the Harlem Renaissance. It was called the New Negro Movement. Why? It was the Negro who was new. She herself was reborn, hence the term Renaissance.
Researchers traced my genealogy.
Economic incentive to lying about the ethnic origins of slaves long before the colonies became the United States genuinely brought Africans to the Americas. And the mainstream sources admit that very few of them came to North America. The only defense argument available is to claim that these are Africans.
Do you notice that a lot of the tribes, they're kind of, or they're, I guess maybe not black.
The Cleveland Indians. It's a picture of Tris Speaker, manager of the Cleveland Indians, and the team mascot. Look at the Indian. Black versus mixed. Quote, thus Negro is used for Indian, not for someone from Africa, end quote.
That the child of an Indian will be known as a mulatto.
And says the Selective Service draft boards during World War II insisted that these Virginia Indians were Negroes, a small group of Virginia Indians.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up out of your sleep, sleep.
No one talks about slave courts when we discuss antebellum history in America, and that's a massive oversight. Several colonies and subsequently states had slave courts which heard cases predicated on lawsuits filed against owners by slaves. We now refer to those cases as freedom suits. The arguments were usually the same on both ends. The plaintiff argued that they should be free because they're indigenous, and the defendant argued that they should remain enslaved because they're African. The Harlem Renaissance, the most famous cultural movement in America that no one can define or explain. Wikipedia currently calls it, quote, an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, politics, and scholarship, centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, spanning the 1920s and 1930s, end quote. Dictionary.com just calls it, quote, a literary movement in the early 1920s that centered on Harlem and was an early manifestation of black consciousness in the US, end quote. Only literary, and now it's an early manifestation, like the birth of something as opposed to the revival of something. I mean, what actually happened? Allow me to answer that question with a bold thesis. Why would it take litigation and due process to prove that an African wasn't American Indian? Think about it. Can't you just tell by looking at him that he's not indigenous to this land? Short answer, no. These cases were necessary because, whether you want to believe it or not, American Indians looked so phenotypically similar to the African slaves that Europeans genuinely couldn't tell the difference. The Harlem Renaissance was when the Negro let go of her predominantly indigenous identity to embrace a fully African identity, and the Negro has stolidly embraced this path ever since. Slave ships genuinely brought African slaves to North America in small numbers. Otherwise, no one would have needed to argue about this. However, the largest mainstream statistic provided for how many African slaves were brought to the North American mainland is only 388,747 people between 1619 and 1860. Yet the 1860 census records this population as having already swelled to 4.4 million people. There is no feasible human birth rate that can bridge that gap, which is how we know the bulk of that figure must have already been here. 17th century Acts of Assembly allowed enslavement for limited time periods of Indians captured in battle and lifetime slavery for Indians purchased from other colonies. In 1691, the Assembly outlawed the enslavement of Indians. Nevertheless, people of Indian descent were still held as slaves, and laws concerning the enslavement of Native Americans changed several times, leading to confusion and lawsuits to determine whether people descended from certain Indians were legally free or enslaved. In 1662, the General Assembly had passed a law stating, "Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother." In Virginia, then, the status of the mother was passed to her child. Therefore, enslaved women gave birth to enslaved children, regardless of the status of the father of the child, or the children, I should say. But the same was true of free women. Their children were automatically free. One path to freedom for a slave held in Virginia was to prove maternal descent from an illegally enslaved Indian woman. Many people gained their freedom by showing that their mother or grandmother was an Indian and therefore was or should have been legally free. End quote. Okay, so basically in 1691, colonial law made it illegal to own American Indians as slaves, but all the prominent local colonial families already owned slaves. Nearly all those slaves were American Indians with only the rarest exceptions. How do we know? Because it's well documented. Voice of America is America's biggest international news broadcaster, and when I did my presentation on the Chichimeco Empire, also known as the Westo Nation or the Savannah River people, I showed you what I'm showing you now. This is Voice of America saying, quote, "Slavery in America is usually associated with Africa and the American South, but Ohio State University historian Margaret Ellen Newell told VOA, Voices of America, that up until 1700, Native Americans comprised the majority of slaves in America." End quote. In fact, the Slave Voyages database reports only 11,000 foreign slaves had disembarked on North American soil by the year 1700. Dr. Robert Finley was a Presbyterian pastor born in 1772, and in 1806 he founded the American Colonization Society, which was a coalition of slave owners and abolitionists who all agreed that black Americans should be freed but relocated to Africa to colonize it themselves and there extend U.S. imperialism. This is the beginning of the Back to Africa movement. It's that ever-so-brilliant virus I mentioned before, a social contagion hatched from the test tube of reductionist white liberalism. Like most diseases on American soil, it came with the pale face. Other abolitionists at the time actually called out the American Colonization Society as a disingenuous commandeering of the real abolitionist movement to simply find a way to economically benefit from freeing the slave as they had from slavery itself. The idea got no support from black leaders at the time until the federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It gave unprecedented power to any slave owners seeking to recapture fugitive slaves or runaways. That's when black people started considering emigrating to Africa to establish a state that protected their rights. A 2014 article in the Journal of the Early Republic quotes a report from a Negro political convention in New York where the Harlem Renaissance would later begin. The report dates back to the 1850s, and it's talking about Liberia, the American colony in Africa that remains as an independent state to this day. Quote, "All kinds of chicanery and stratagem will be employed to allure the people to the African colony, the independence of its inhabitants." the enjoyment and privileges of its citizens will be pictured forth in glowing colors to deceive you." End quote. At that time, first-wave civil rights icon Frederick Douglass owned a newspaper in which he addressed what he called the colonization scheme. Douglass wrote, quote, "There is no sentiment more universally entertained nor more firmly held by the free-colored people of the United States than that this is their own, their native land, and that here, for good or for evil, their destiny is to be wrought out." Identified with the entire history of the American people going back more than 200 years, this sentiment is natural and praiseworthy. There is not now, there never has been, and we think there never will be, any general desire on the part of our people to emigrate from this land to any other, and least of all to the wilds of Africa. End quote. Notice the phrase, identified with the entire history of the American people. Does he just mean U.S. citizens, or does he mean true Americans, the Aborigines? Does he call America their native land because living Negroes then were born here, or because they were indigenous? We might be able to glean his authorial intent by comparing this text to the speech he gave at the Carlisle Indian Institute, wherein he said, quote, "I have been known as a Negro, but I wish to be known here and now as Indian," end quote. We're going to read the rest of this too, but think about this for a second. If you're a slave in 1695, you're most likely an Indian according to mainstream stats, yet you now need to prove you're an Indian in order to gain your freedom. Why do we need witness testimony, opposing litigators, and a judge to figure out whether or not you're an Indian? There's two main reasons. The primary reason is because slave owners don't want to lose slaves because that's a loss of property. Subtracting assets directly impinges upon net worth and productivity. In many cases, it was you and several siblings all petitioning for freedom together. So this owner is about to lose a massive swath of his workforce. It's only logical that he's going to argue that you're not actually an Indian, and that's why we even have a case here. Everyone knows slaves tend to be Indians, but if the owner claims you're not an Indian, then that means he's not breaking the law to keep you enslaved. Don't forget, he's the defendant here. You're suing for freedom, which makes you the plaintiff. He has to defend himself against the claim that he's illegally working you as a slave. The court will give him the benefit of the doubt when he says you're not Indian, but then the question remains, what are you? What do you think he called you in 1695 if he's saying you're not an Indian? What else could you be? African. You have to be an African. What I'm showing you is that there was a systemic economic incentive to lying about the ethnic origins of slaves long before the colonies became the United States. Quote, in the May 1772 case of Robin versus Hardaway, the General Court ruled that for most of the 17th century it had been illegal to enslave Indians who had been brought into Virginia. That case, on which Thomas Jefferson, a young attorney, took notes, resulted in freedom for 12 Dinwiddie County descendants of Indian women who had been sold into slavery in Virginia between 1682 and 1748. Some cases, like the one of Charles Evans and others versus Lewis B. Allen, used evidence proving descent through many generations back to the original Indian ancestor. This genealogical chart and petition listing the descendants of Jane Gibson, who was described as an Indian woman, quote unquote, were submitted in evidence during a Lynchburg court proceeding that began in 1804 to secure the freedom of her numerous descendants who had also been held in slavery for their entire lives. That case was never resolved. The court-appointed lawyer for Gibson's descendants suffered a nervous breakdown and failed to follow through on the case, leaving the unrepresented plaintiffs enslaved. End quote. So first off, What we just read let us know about a case in which a slave owner was proven to be operating illegally by keeping 12 slaves who were actually supposed to be free because they were secretly Indians. They had to prove that they were Indians based on descent from a specific Indian woman who was sold into slavery in either the late 1600s or early 1700s. They succeeded and won their freedom. Next, we finally get to the case from which this document comes. Charles Evans et al. Versus Lewis B. Allen. This case was heard in 1804, and the enslaved plaintiffs were assigned an attorney by the district. The plaintiffs had been enslaved their entire lives, just like the 12 slaves from the other case. Their case was suspended indefinitely, however, because their attorney conveniently and unexpectedly refused to continue the case, due to having, apparently, a nervous breakdown for some reason. So they remained slaves. It's not impossible that foul play could have been involved here, but we have no way of confirming any of that. What we know is that the owner's argument was that the plaintiffs weren't indigenous, which meant he was either implicitly or explicitly calling them Africans. Guys, what we're about to talk about is a game changer. In short, Unehiya is a small team of highly capable individuals trying to lobby Congress for federal recognition of Black Americans as pre-Columbian American Indians. I'm one of them. I'm the public information officer, so I'm out front recruiting and providing information. I'm also handling PR because of my background in print journalism. I want to appeal to everyone watching this video to support the campaign by joining Unehiya. And guess what? You don't even have to know a single thing about politics or history. Just help us build our list of demands and help each other use Unehiya's genealogy tools to identify your ancestral tribes. Vote yes or no on the hundreds of decisions we have to make. Participate in our tribal town hall meetings after every new moon. If you got any spare change, use it to become a stakeholder in Unehiya, which can be done for as little as $7. You can opt into stakeholder leadership for about $20 if you've got the budget for it. Believe it or not, it only takes 5 minutes to help us reclassify ourselves as Indians. Let's go! The New York Times describes it this way, quote, "The celebration around her was originally intended to honor that book, There is Confusion. But Charles S. Johnson and Elaine Locke thought the dinner could serve a larger purpose." What if the two Black academic titans invited the best and brightest of the Harlem creative and political scene? Skipping to the next paragraph. What the resulting dinner led to, nurtured over the years in the pristine sitting rooms of brownstones and the buzzing corner booths of jazz clubs, was the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of intellectual and artistic activity that would give the neighborhood and its residents global renown. End quote. If there's one name mentioned in that missive that should steal the show, it's that of Elaine Locke, the Fraser Crane of 1920s Black Harlem. He's the author of a classic anthology in American literature, commonly celebrated in African American studies. It was published the following year under the title The New Negro, An Interpretation. That book is perhaps as misunderstood as the circumstances surrounding it. Go back to Wikipedia, and you'll be reminded that the Harlem Renaissance wasn't originally called the Harlem Renaissance. It was called the New Negro Movement. Why? It's because the literature's not what was new, nor the music, the art, or the dance. Those were all just the impossibly gorgeous symptoms of a much more frighteningly brilliant virus. It was the Negro who was new. She herself was reborn, hence the term Renaissance. Literature, music, art, and dance are all just facets of culture, and culture is the cornerstone of ethnic identity. If all those things changed, then Black identity changed, and the change became an international spectacle. For the first time, Black Americans were willfully identifying as Africans. Just a century ago, Euro-Americans in the US actually viewed Negro citizens as the most authentic representation of American Indians. Today, that sounds ludicrous to not only them, but to Black Americans too. Why did they think that way 100 years ago? First of all, let's produce some receipts to prove white people even did think that way. As of the posting of this video, it's currently May 2025. It so happens that last month, April 18th to be precise, was the anniversary of the release of a rare, valuable old baseball photograph from the opening of Henley Field in Lakeland, Florida. The photo belonged to Newspaper Enterprise Association, which was like Getty Images, but in the early 1900s. And Henley Field back then was called Athletic Park. The photo, now worth about $300, was from the opening of the field about 3 years prior, when it was christened by the Cleveland Indians. It's a picture of Tris Speaker, manager of the Cleveland Indians, and the team mascot. The mascot is a teenage boy holding a bow and arrow. Why? Because the mascot of the Cleveland Indians would have to be an Indian, obviously. In fact, the original name given to the photo by the NEA was Cleveland Indians presented with mascot. You can see all that in caps at the beginning of the inscription. Let's read the first sentence for the sake of your own verification. Quote, Cleveland Indians presented with mascot at opening of new $125,000 athletic field at Lakeland, Florida, their training camp, end quote. Look at the Indian. Today, he would be called an African American. But Negroes in the U.S. wouldn't start identifying as Africans until after the influence of the Harlem Renaissance had time to propagate. The Harlem Renaissance lasted through the 1930s, but started in April 1924, just 1 year prior to this event. Its influence was non-existent at this time because its primary movers and shakers hadn't yet done any of the things that ignited the movement. To get a breakdown on that, go watch my video on how the Harlem Renaissance silenced American Indians. While the Negro was reinventing everything, Marcus Garvey was suddenly galvanizing a rejuvenated Back to Africa movement, this time from within the black community. The point is, there was no sense of Afrocentrism in the black American community yet. The white people didn't yet see black people as singularly African. They felt this black kid was a perfect representation of what they considered an authentic Indian to be. The question historians should ask in that process, apropos of the Harlem Renaissance, should be whether or not there was a pressing reason at the time for the Negro to reinvent her identity. In fact, there was, and Congress has acknowledged that in recent years, without connecting it to the Harlem Renaissance. Democratic Representative Jim Moran of Virginia told the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in 2008, quote, "It has been called a paper genocide. At a time when the federal government granted Native Americans the right to vote, Virginia's elected officials adopted racial hostile laws targeted at those classes of people who did not fit into the dominant white society. The fact that some of Virginia's ruling elite claimed to be blood descendants of Pocahontas, in their view, meant that no one else in Virginia could make a claim that they were Native American and a descendant of Pocahontas's people. To do so would mean that Virginia's ruling elite were what they decreed all non-whites to be, part of the inferior Negroid race. With great hypocrisy, Virginia's ruling elite pushed policies that culminated with the enactment of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This act directed state officials and zealots like Walter Plecker to destroy state and local courthouse records and reclassify in Orwellian fashion all non-whites as colored. It targeted Native Americans with a vengeance, denying Native Americans in Virginia their identity. To call yourself a Native American in Virginia was to risk a jail sentence of up to 1 year. End quote. Once again, I need to focus your attention on the 20th century, which is fraught with confused white historians who deemed it necessary to investigate the odd placements of black people in Aboriginal contexts here in the U.S. Today, we're investigating the implications of the first page of an article from historian Paul T. Murray, published in 1987. So what do you make of this title? Who is an Indian? Who is a Negro? Virginia Indians in the World War II Draft. It was published by the Virginia Historical Society in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. Quote, "Few Americans have ever had the occasion to ponder deeply these questions. In most cases, the answer is self-evident. A racial label is usually assigned by reference to obvious physical criteria, such as skin color, hair texture, and facial characteristics. But in any multiracial society, there are some people who cannot be neatly placed into one of a limited number of categories. Further, in a society where one's social position depends heavily upon race, resolving questions of racial classification becomes a serious issue. People of mixed race may attempt to improve their position by changing their racial designation. Such an attempt forces government officials to confront directly the delicate issue of the determination of race. Their decisions have far-reaching consequences, not only for the people directly involved, but also for the entire society. During the Second World War, a small group of Virginia Indians challenged the prevailing system of racial classification. When called to register with the selective service system, they listed their race as Indian. Local draft boards, however, would not accept this claim. They recalled that in antebellum days, some of the registrants' ancestors had married free Negroes. Based on this quote-unquote evidence, the boards insisted that the proper classification for all alleged Indians was Negro. The Indians were adamant in refusing this designation. Draft board members were equally determined not to classify the men as Indians because such a classification would mean that they would be sent to military service together with whites. End quote. So the takeaway is that during World War II, which was from 1939 to 1945, Virginia Indians tried to register with the selective service system, but the draft boards insisted that they were Negroes. A year after Jim Moran made his statement before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, the chairman of the committee was Democratic North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan. He submitted a report in 2009 wherein he explicitly stated, quote, the primary target of the racial integrity law was the African American community. End quote. This statement was even truer than he realized. Even as members of Congress have acknowledged these things, they never seem to realize how broadly the scope of what they're saying actually applies. You can tell even by how he phrased that sentence that he's still viewing this problem through a modern lens. He used the term African American. That New York Times article from earlier also used the term African American, too. That term is a product of the culmination of the new Negro movement long after the fact. It didn't exist at the time. Why do you think they'd even choose an African boy to represent American Indians? What sense does that make? Wouldn't that just confuse people? How would fans even know that this kid was supposed to be viewed as an Indian? They don't even think he needs to wear a headdress or any feathered regalia to sell it either. He's wearing almost nothing, which means they think his physical features are sufficient representation of an Indian. They consider this authentic. The reason I'm showing you all this is to demonstrate that in 1987, when Paul Murray publishes the article we started with and says the selective service draft boards during World War II insisted that these Virginia Indians were Negroes, Murray is not accounting for what the leading historian on the subject had published just 3 years prior about the word Negro being used to describe Indians. He may have been aware of it, but he's using the word the way his audience would understand it, which is to refer to African descendants of the slave trade. So Murray entertains the notion that American Indians mixed with Africans and thereby created a lot of black Indians. But he says the draft board officials refused to let these Indians identify as Indians because of what they looked like. They labeled these men Negroes in a late period when Negro came to mean African. And their evidence that these were Africans was that some Indian tribes had been known to mix with African freedmen.
So these white officials in the 1940s decided to run with the assumption that these Virginia Indians weren't Indian because they were dark-skinned with coarse hair. But in 1987, when Murray's writing about this, the part we read doesn't talk about the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which passed 2 decades prior to World War II.
On December 20th of 1988, the Associated Press credited Jesse Jackson with emphasizing a new term being debated in the late 80s. Quote, "A group of black leaders, including the Reverend Jesse Jackson, says members of their race would prefer to be called African Americans rather than blacks." End quote. The headline said, "Leaders say blacks want to be called African Americans." That's extremely recent. That was the year George Bush Sr. beat Michael Dukakis in the general election. This so-called hyphenated identity gradually grew over the course of the 70 years that followed the new Negro movement. Negroes spent those years pivoting to Afrocentrism because the fascination with possible African roots and slave trade studies was considered woke in Alain Locke's day.